Let's talk about the enhanced input system in Unreal Engine. It is still relatively new, but it is really, really cool, and you can do some really powerful stuff with it. So if you've made, since Unreal 5, effectively, any new projects, you'll have seen your default input mappings looking a little bit like this. Enhanced input action, IA_jump, and then we've got move, and then we've got look. Let's talk about what this actually means. So the structure of the enhanced input system is that we have these input actions, which are assets in and of themselves, that can have certain value types. So in this case, most things are going to be bools, but sometimes you have an axis in one dimension that can be a float, or an axis in 2 dimensions that can be a vector 2D, or an axis in 3 dimensions that can be a vector. So normal buttons are just, press it or you don't. So those you will mark as bools. Actions that might require a little bit more finesse with one axis, like the L2 and R2 buttons on a PlayStation controller. I believe Xbox controllers do the same thing. Those would be axis 1D. They only have one axis, but they have a 0 to 1 scale. So if you press them in halfway through, maybe the thing that you're doing, like sprinting, for instance, you're only halfway sprinting, something like that. An axis 2D would be something like your analog stick, something that has both an X and a Y. The analog sticks, for instance, go on a -1 to +1 scale in both X and Y, so that you can look around and walk around the world in your 3D game fairly easily. Normal controllers usually don't have an axis 3D input method. Maybe some type of gyro would work for that, or if you have a custom-made controller that does something in 3 dimensions, you will use axis 3D as just a 3D vector. Generally speaking, that's not something that you use all that often. Most things are going to be bools. Sometimes you'll use a float, and sometimes you will use a vector 2D. Vector 3D is there to support it, mostly. So once you've made that, you will note that you can't bind any buttons to it or any functionality to it in here. This is literally just setting up your value type, the triggers that it works with. We'll get back to these triggers in a moment. Once you've made your input actions, so every single action that you can do in your game, attacking, looking around, moving, jumping, scrolling through a weapon wheel, whatever you really want is going to be a bespoke action in and of itself. And those actions are going to be put together into this asset called an input mapping context. In here, you add in your mappings by pressing on this plus button and then choosing your input mapping. We'll make an entire separate input action in a moment to show you. But once you've done that, you can assign different inputs to them. So jump will be spacebar, or the gamepad face button bottom, or just the touchscreen touch input 1. These are all just normal press them and it works kind of buttons. So they are, like we said here in the input action, they are bools. They're just a 0 or a 1. But you'll also see that in the move and the look here, we have some other stuff set up. So we have the gamepad left thumbstick 2D axis. And that is because the move action, as we will see, is set up as a axis 2D. So it's going to be providing, whenever we do something with that gamepad left thumbstick, the value of the thumbstick at that point in both the X and the Y value. But these are all just normal buttons. WASD, up, left, right, down. How do we map those? Again, that's a question that we'll get into in a moment. You can see the mouse also has a 2D XY axis that we can use for looking. So now if we open up, for instance, the W key, we can see that it has a modifier on it. And that is to say that it takes in a single value and is going to modify it to function as a part of a 2D value. So if we go the modifier here, in this case, it's what that does. It has the swizzle input access value modifier, and it has a certain order, which is Y, X, and Z. That is because we only care about filling in the first one here, because we only have a one-dimensional input, which is just 0 or 1. So we want to set the Y input here to either 0 or 1 based on our W input. The same thing will happen in the S input, but it has 2 modifiers instead. It has the swizzle input axis values, which is going to be Y, X, Z, because we want to put the value into the Y of the XYZ. But it also has a negate because, of course, when we press the S key, we're pressing down. And when we're pressing down, we want it to actually be a negative number. So that is what a negate modifier does. And you can see there's a fair few more modifiers that we can go through here. Most of these, I think, are pretty self-explanatory. Things like negates or a response curve, which will take in a value and output another value based on a curve, which you have a default exponential for, or you can use your own input curve as well. You can scale by delta time, meaning that it will make a frame rate independent input if that is if you need that for any reason whatsoever. The more interesting part of this definitely is the triggers, and that's what I want to talk about in a moment here once we've gone through all this. And then, of course, in the A and the D, you will see something similar. The modifier here is just a negate modifier, because the A will be the negative side, the D will be the non-negative side, so it won't have any modifiers, because this is important. When we press a button that only has a bool value, right? So it only has a B value, that is effectively just a 0 or a 1. That's the numeric expression of those. So we can very easily put that into a vector 2D, right? If we have a like vector 2D that has a X component and a Y component. So if we try to put a bool just into a vector 2D, what it will do is it will always go to the first component that it can find. So that would be the X component in this case. That's what the swizzle input does, is it changes what the first component it sees is. And that's why for the other ones, for the up and down, we swizzled it around to have the Y input as the first one in the vector. So that when we put a singular number into it, it goes into the Y instead of into the X. If you need to put something into the X, you can just put it into the vector 2D and it will just put it into the X. Same thing if for any reason you have a just normal vector 3D, of course, that gets split into an X, a Y, and a Z. You can swizzle them around. By default, it's going to put whatever value you have into the X, but you can swizzle them around to have the Y be the first or even the Z be the first. That is why this swizzle input is such a powerful modifier. If that all doesn't make full sense, we're going to go through and make a input action of our own. We're going to set this up as just a normal bool to trigger a thing on our blueprint in a moment, and we'll go through the entire process one step at a time. The last thing before we do that though is you will see in our third person character on begin play, we are casting to our player controller. We're getting our controller, casting to the player controller, and with the player controller, we're getting the enhanced input local player subsystem, which is a whole mouthful, but we need that because that allows us to add a mapping context. So with our local player subsystem, we can add a mapping context to our player controller so that it knows that, hey, whenever we run any of these inputs, it will fire the corresponding events on whatever our player controller is possessing, which in this case, of course, would be our third-person character blueprint. So that is how these events for input action look and move and jump actually hook up to the buttons that we assign here, because we're running this node called mapping context, for which we need the input player subsystem. And now that we've gone through all that, these nodes might start making a little bit more sense, because this look is a input action that is defined as being an axis 2D. So you can see it has an action value X and an action value Y, because it is a two-dimensional vector. The same thing with the inputs for the movement. But when we go to the jump input, we don't get an X and a Y action value. The action value is just a bool, a true or a false, because it is just supposed to be a normal button press, and we define it as such when making it. So finally, let's make a new input action. I just always personally look it up in here as input action. It is under the input category, which makes sense. And let's call this input action test. If we open this up, we can set value type to bool, which is what we're going to do. We can also say we can trigger this when paused. So if this is something that needs to be able to trigger when you have like your game paused in a menu, for instance, you want to set this to true so that your character can still provide input through to your widgets and that kind of stuff. We're going to not use anything in here. We could set up some triggers or some modifiers in the action itself. That way it has its own default values and the mapping context can either just take those or overwrite them. I personally prefer making those entirely in the mapping context, because for a lot of games that you're going to be making, you're probably only ever going to set up like 1 or maybe 2 mapping contexts anyway. So it's nice to just have them all within the same like little menu here. Now that we've made a new input action though, input action test, we can see that it is available here for us to pick in this drop-down menu. And now we can start adding some input bindings to it. So let's say I want to run this on the P key, and then I can add another mapping to it as well. It does sometimes do this little buggy thing where it opens up other tabs again, kind of annoying. And I also want to run this on numpad 8, something weird like that, right? And here we get into the triggers. This is what I wanted to talk about most of all. The triggers are what make enhanced input so unbelievably cool to work with. So let's go add a trigger to the P key here, which again, you can also add these triggers to the input action as a whole. So that way they will apply to every single one of these. So that can be kind of nice. But we have a bunch of different trigger things that we can do. The first one is a ordered action. That means that it's only going to trigger this when another action is already in the process of being triggered, or when you already have another hand held down in most cases. We can combo things, which is technically in beta, but it actually works quite well, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is a combo of other input actions that need to happen in order for this input action to trigger. So if you have, for instance, a fighting game where you need to press up and attack, but not at the same time, quickly after each other to do like an uppercut attack, or maybe you have down and attack to like do a slam down or whatever, that's what you would use combo for. Once again, this is for inputs that need to happen after each other, and this one is for inputs that need to happen at the same time. Then, of course, we have the down trigger, which will trigger when it's first pressed down. Then we have the hold trigger. This one is a little bit more tricky to explain. So the hold trigger is probably easiest if I just show you the options that it has. So if we add it in, you can see we got a couple of extra options, and it has a threshold. So hold won't start triggering until that threshold is met. So if we set this to, for instance, 5 seconds. If I now press the P key, I need to hold it down for 5 seconds until it starts triggering this input action. We can define it as being a one-shot, which means that it will only trigger once. And if we don't do this, it will trigger on every frame. I will just show you actually. Let's go into our BP third-person character, and I will add the input action test event. And here we have a handful of different pins. For now, we're going to worry only about the triggered. I will go over the other ones in a moment. But I will print string, hello, triggered. So if all goes well, if we press the numpad 8 key, it will immediately start printing hello on every frame. But with the P key, I need to hold it down for 5 entire seconds before it will print it only once, because I am now enabled this is one shot. So let's try that. I start the game, numpad 8, it spams hello, as you would expect. Let it just clear out. Now that I'm pressing the P key though, it's going to take a few seconds for it to appear. And after a few seconds, it will say hello, only once, because it is a one shot. So that is what hold means. Then of course we also have hold and release, which does something very similar, but only fires it when I actually release that button after it's been held down for that amount of time. Pressed is the initial press down of a button. So the difference between pressed and down is that with pressed, it only fires on the initial button press. It doesn't fire again and again and again and again and again. With down, it will fire at every single frame as long as it's being held down. We're going to skip over pulse real quick. We'll circle back to that in a moment, because a press also has its counterpart, that being released, which I don't think I need to explain at this point. It will fire when you release the key, so when you let go of it. Now, we have pulse and tap to go. Tap also seems fairly self-explanatory. I'm just going to show you real quick. If I go to tap, it has a tap release time. This is just pressing it and releasing it within this time will result in this triggering. If you hold it down for too long, it doesn't count as a tap, so it won't fire. For most of the time-based things, we also have this little checkbox whether or not it is affected by time dilation. So if your time dilation for either your actor or your entire game is set to like play in slow motion, like 1/10 the speed, Do we want the inputs and the timing of those inputs to still be affected by that? So create a bigger window, or if your game is speed up, a smaller window to do these timed events? Or do we want these timed events to be entirely separate and be real-time, unaffected by time dilation? So that's what these time dilation checkboxes do. That leaves us with pulse. Pulse is a little bit of a weird one. This will trigger once every X amount of time as long as you're holding it down. And you can also limit to the amount of times that it can trigger. So we can say once a second, as long as this thing is being held down for only 5 seconds, do we want to trigger this? And then we need to release and press down again in order to be able to do anything with it. And we don't need to change anything about this because it's entirely the settings in our input mappings that have to do with this. So if we now just play, we will see it does 1, 2, 3, 4, in a moment now 5, and then it will start disappearing because it stops printing new hello messages. So that's what all the different trigger options do. Again, this is really, really quite powerful. You can do a lot of stuff with this. I want to show you a coordinate action and combo in action a little bit more because they're a little bit weird to work with at times. So I'm going to make a new input action real quick. I'm just going to call it test2, and we're going to map that as well. And I will map this test2 just to the P key again, and we will remove all the other input mappings that we have here, or at least for the P. And then I will set this to the I key so that they're a little bit closer together. We'll start with the coordinate action. So this coordinate action lets me put in a different input action that needs to fire together with this one for it to count. So if I do input test 1, if I don't give any other trigger values in here, it's just going to be triggering every frame as long as something is being held down. So the P key will now fire infinitely, just like we saw with numpad 8 a moment ago. And when also I is being pressed together with the P key, will test now fire. And of course, that needs to go together with input action too. You can't code with the same input action that you're mapping to because it's never going to fire. So if I press the P key, nothing happens. If I press the I key, nothing happens. But if I press the I key and then the P key, you can see it starts printing hello on every single frame. If I press the P key first and then the I key, it also works. So no matter the order that I push these in, it's just when both of these are being pressed in, that is when this will actually fire. So that can be things like combination keys, like shift attack does something different than normal attack, that kind of thing. And of course, we can do some other stuff with this. We can say, well, this is a coordinate action, but it's also going to have another trigger, which is for instance, a hold trigger, which means that we need to be holding down the I key for at least a second while also holding down the P key for this to fire. And you can start mixing and matching these things together to get really weird and creative input solutions. Maybe sometimes a little too weird and creative. Don't overdo it. Now, the other thing that I wanted to show is, we can just delete this one, is the combo. And you will note that the moment I press this combo, the trigger that we're using, the input for this will disappear because we're now mapping this action to a combination of other actions happening. So it doesn't have its own input key anymore. Instead, what we can do is we can add combo actions and also cancel actions. We're just going to focus on the combo actions themselves. So let's add 2 of them. And we can just add the input test 2 for this twice in a row. And let's say that input test 2 has a trigger of its own and say that it is a tap trigger. So now I need to tap it twice in a row within a time of 0.5 seconds, because if I do this one and then wait longer, then the time to press key is going to also cancel out of the combo. So I need to do this one, then within this time, do this one, within this time, let's keep it at 0.5, do the next one, and so on and so forth. And once it reaches the end of this entire array, that is when it will trigger the input action test. So we will see, if I tap it once, nothing happens. And if I just talk for a bit and I tap it again, nothing happens. But if I tap it twice in a row quickly, it prints hello. Now, each one of these combo steps, we can also say whether or not we wanted to start on triggered or started or ongoing or cancelled or completed. So we could say, for instance, the first one, we want to wait for it to trigger entirely, but the second one, we actually want to start this the moment we press it down. So when we start it, and we can select multiple at once. I just want started in this case. So now, instead of having to double tap and it only printing once I release the second time, it's going to print hello the moment I press down the second time. So I don't even have to release the second tap for it to print hello. Which brings us to, I think, the final thing that I want to talk about here, and that is these different output pins, which of course correspond to the options that we have here. We've been working with triggered so far, and for the most part, that is what you are going to do if you're working with all these like special trigger events. If you don't put anything into these triggers, this will just fire every frame as long as you have your input held down. So it will effectively be the same as ongoing. Then we have started, which is the initial press down. So if you go, for instance, to the input action jump, it doesn't deal with things like triggered or ongoing. It's just when the input that is mapped to it is started, we jump, and when it is completed, which is the other side of that coin, it is going to stop jumping. So completed is when you let go of the button. Then we also have cancelled, which is a little bit of a weird one. If for any reason an input action is cancelled because, for instance, you disable the input on the character that it was being inputted on, or maybe a different input action like takes priority over it and does something weird with it, that is where this fires. Cancelled doesn't actually come into play all that much. Mostly we use started, completed, and triggered to actually program in input logic. That's been a hopefully kind of brief and understandable overview of the enhanced input system in Unreal Engine. You can do a lot of fun stuff with this. It also allows for you to remap keys instead of just using like predefined keys, but I feel like that might be left best for a video in and of itself. And a very big thank you to all of my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help out supporting the channel, there's a link down below in the description to the Patreon page. A huge thank you to my Cave Digger tier supporters, Sir J. Thomas,